Dawn over the Willamette Valley, 40 acres of apple trees breathing mist into a cold October sky. Zoom past the fog to a weathered farmhouse, a single porch light still burning against the blue. Inside, an old woman's calloused hands close around a coffee mug, steady, certain the hands of someone who has kept a dying craft alive for 50 years. Her pale eyes lift toward the southern slope, where her late husband's life's work waits heavy with fruit that grows nowhere else on earth. Then over the ridge, a black SUV, tires crawling up the gravel drive, unhurried and titled. A polished shoe steps down into the mud, a smile too white, a suit too clean for a working farm. Two figures now facing each other across a porch rail. One has guarded this ground since the day she buried him. The other has come to erase it. Neither knows yet what a quiet widow protects when everything she loves is threatened. Half a century of botanical history erased in a matter of seconds beneath the churning steel treads of corporate machinery. That is where this story ends for most people who hear it told in passing at feed stores or church suppers across the Willamette Valley. But the men who assumed they had crushed an aging widow under the weight of their ambition never understood that some roots run too deep to sever with a blade. They believed they had broken a 72-year-old woman alone on her land. What they had actually done was awaken something they possessed, neither the wisdom to anticipate nor the resources to survive. For 5 decades, the Rooker place had stood like an emerald island in a rising tide of concrete. All around it, the family farms that once stitched the valley together had surrendered one by one to the surveyors and the sod cutters, their pastures paved into cul-de-sacs, their barns raised for retention ponds. Opal Rooker had watched every one of them fall. She had shaken the hands of neighbors as they signed away 3 generations of soil for a check that felt enormous, until the ink dried, until they understood that no amount of money could buy back the smell of alfalfa at dawn or the particular slant of light through an old walnut grove in September. She had refused to become one of them. Her 40 acres were not a commodity. They were a cathedral. Opal had never called herself a scientist, and in truth she was not one, though she had spent 40 years married to a man who was. The county knew her as the flinty widow with dirt permanently seamed into the creases of her knuckles, the one who drove a truck older than most of the men who worked the neighboring construction sites. What almost none of them grasped was that the woman kept alive single-handed a knowledge of pomology so exact that agricultural researchers occasionally made the drive south from the university just to walk her rows and ask her questions she could still answer when no one else living could. She had learned the craft at her husband's elbow across 4 decades, learned to graft rare and nearly vanished apple varieties onto sturdy century-old rootstock back when organic farming was still a fringe eccentricity, rather than a marketing slogan back when she was a young bride with soil under her nails and a lifetime ahead of her. That husband had been Silas. He had died 4 winters ago, a sudden failure of the heart that took him between one row and the next on an ordinary spring morning, and the hole he left behind had never once shrunk, only learned to sit quieter in her chest. He had been the true master, the breeder, the patient genius who could coax a new life out of old wood, and when he fell, she had knelt in the mud beside him and made him a promise he could no longer hear, that she would not let the trees go to strangers who saw only lumber where the 2 of them had seen a marriage. She had scattered his ashes under the grand oak by the creek with her own hands, and Opal Rooker was not a woman who broke her word to the dead. The crown jewel of the property occupied a 12-acre block along the farm's southernmost slope, where the morning fog pooled longest and the soil held a particular mineral richness the Rookers had spent decades coaxing toward perfection. This was no ordinary commercial planning, no monotonous grid of Honeycrisp or Gala bred for supermarket shelves and shipping durability. This was the heritage block, and every tree in it carried a story that could not be reordered from a nursery catalog. Here grew the Arkansas black, its skin so darkly burnished it resembled polished mahogany in the low autumn sun. Beside them stood a stand of Hewish crab, a small, astringent apple prized by the finest cider makers, its bloodline traceable clear back to the vineyards of Mount Vernon, and the careful hand of a founding father who had understood, as the Rookers did, that a nation's true wealth grew slowly from the ground. But the most precious thing rooted in that southern soil was a variety Silas had spent 3 full decades perfecting, a late frost-resistant deep crimson cider apple with a tannin structure so complex that distilleries across the Pacific Northwest had only recently begun to comprehend what they were tasting. He had named it Rooker's Crimson. It existed nowhere else on the face of the earth, and now only one person alive knew how to keep it breathing. Silas had left Opal more than grief when he went. He had left her a ledger, a bound and yellowing record, in which he had cataloged every graft, every rootstock, every experimental crossbreed across half a century of trial and heartbreak. And he had taught her to read it the way other couples learn to read one another's silences. And he had left her one document more valuable than any of them, a quiet, unpublicized agreement he had entered into years earlier with the National Botanical Registry, an arrangement that classified the entire heritage block as a site of critical agricultural biodiversity under the protection of the National Clonal Germplasm Repository. Opal had filed it away in the iron floor safe beneath the study rug and mentioned it to no one. A woman did not brandish a thing like that. A woman kept it in reserve the way her own father had kept a shotgun oiled and unspoken above the barn door. At 72, Opal Rooker was nobody's fragile relic. Her hands had been hardened by decades of pruning shears until they closed around a tool with the unconscious certainty of a woman greeting an old friend. Her spine had been straightened, not bent by a lifetime of harsh valley winters. She rose before the sun without an alarm because her body had forgotten how to do otherwise, and she worked the property with the help of a few seasonal hands, selling her rare fruit to boutique cideries at prices that would have astonished anyone who mistook her for a struggling old farm wife. She was content in the specific, unglamorous way of a person who has found the exact work her soul was shaped for. She wanted for nothing the world could sell her. But progress, as the zoning board had taken to calling it in their bright fluorescent meeting rooms, was a hungry thing, and it had grown teeth. Marsh Thornton Holdings had rolled into the valley the previous year with the smooth confidence of a firm that had never lost a fight it chose to pick. A real estate development conglomerate headquartered in Portland, they had quietly assembled 300 acres of former farmland, encircling the Rooker property, buying up the neighbors who had finally tired of holding out. Their vision bore the name The Reserve at Cedar Hollow, and it was everything Opal despised distilled into a glossy rendering, a sprawling luxury subdivision of faux farmhouse mansions, a manicured golf course carved from what had once been productive pasture, paved walking trails, winding past artificial ponds where real creeks had run for 10,000 years. There existed only a single flaw in their meticulous master plan, and that flaw was 40 acres wide. Opal Rooker's land sat squarely in the heart of what their engineers had designated as Phase 3. The pressure began the way such things always do, wearing a pleasant face. Glossy brochures appeared in her mailbox, offering complimentary property valuations, their covers printed with photographs of silver-haired couples laughing on beaches that existed nowhere near Oregon. Then came the telephone calls, cheerful young associates with rehearsed warmth, asking whether Opal had given any thought to simplifying her life to enjoying her golden years, unburdened by the demands of the land. She fed the brochures into the wood stove one at a time, watching the beaches curl and blacken, and she hung up on the associates without malice, the way a person swats a fly that has not yet learned the window is closed. When courtesy accomplished nothing, the firm dispatched its senior acquisitions director. Dalton Marsh arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning, uninvited, his black luxury SUV, rolling up the gravel drive with the unhurried arrogance of a man who had never once been told no and meant it. He wore an Italian suit worth more than most of the trucks in the valley wore it to a working farm, as though the mud itself ought to feel honored. Opal met him on the porch, a mug of black coffee steaming in one hand, her posture as unmoved as a fence post set in concrete. Dalton's smile arrived before he did, revealing teeth of an unnatural expensive whiteness. He came directly to his point, the way men do when they believe the outcome already belongs to them. Her property, he explained, represented the final piece of a development that would reshape the region, and Marsh Thornton stood prepared to offer $2.5 million, a figure that dwarfed anything agricultural zoning could justify. He painted the picture with practiced ease, a beach house in Carmel Travel, a soft landing after a hard life. He spoke as though he were doing the old woman a kindness. Opal let him finish. Then she looked out past the visitor's polished shoulder toward the southern slope, where the ancient, twisted branches of the heritage block hung heavy with the coming harvest, and she set her coffee down on the porch rail with a deliberateness that carried more weight than any raised voice. My husband's ashes are worked into the soil under the old oak by the creek. Every tree on that slope came off the graft by his hand, and I have kept every one of them alive with mine since the day he died. You are standing here trying to buy a puzzle piece, Mr. Marsh, and I am telling you that you are looking at a grave, a workshop, and a 50-year prayer. None of the three is listed for sale. The warmth drained from Dalton Marsh's eyes so completely that the smile still hanging on his mouth became something ghoulish, a mask that had outlived its wearer. He let a silence stretch, then filled it with a softer, colder register. Opal was an old woman living alone, he observed, and farming was a young person's occupation. Property taxes had a way of climbing. Urban growth boundaries had a way of shifting. A wise person took the money before circumstances made the choice for her. Opal's voice, when it came, had the flat edge of a pruning blade drawn across bone. Is that a threat you drove all the way out here to deliver? Dalton merely turned back toward his vehicle, unbothered already elsewhere. Marsh Thornton, he offered over his shoulder as a parting gift, always secured the ground it required. The firm preferred to pay for it. But there were, he added, ways of working around a stubborn obstacle when paying failed to move it. The SUV pulled away, and Opal stood on her porch for a long time after the dust had settled, watching the empty road, feeling the first cold understanding that the fight ahead would not be conducted with checks and handshakes. She was right to feel it. Over the 6 months that followed, the difficulties began arriving in forms too diffuse to accuse anyone of directly, each one a small wound that bled slowly. It started with water. The developers successfully petitioned the county to reroute a drainage canal along the valley's eastern edge, a technical adjustment buried in the minutes of a meeting Opal had no reason to attend. The consequence announced itself 2 weeks later when an ordinary autumn rain, the sort her northern pasture had shrugged off for 50 years, instead pooled and spread until a third of her grazing land lay drowned under standing water. She walked the flooded ground in rubber boots at dusk, watching the reflection of a bruised sky ripple where her grass should have been, and she understood with grim clarity that this was no accident of engineering. Water flows where men with permits decide it should flow. Then came the noise. Anonymous complaints began reaching the county sheriff callers reporting that Opal ran her tractor at unreasonable hours, disturbing the peace of residents, who, as far as she could tell, did not yet exist, since Cedar Hollow remained a muddy field of surveyors' stakes. The agricultural exemptions that had protected working farms since before Dalton Marsh was born should have ended the matter, but the deputies still had to drive out and take the reports, and each visit ate an hour of her morning and left a residue of insult she could not quite scrub off. A person who has done nothing wrong still feels something curdle in her when the law keeps knocking. The fences arrived last, and they were the cruelest touch because they were legal. Marsh Thornton erected massive chain-link barriers precisely along the shared property line, then wove green privacy slats through every link until the scenic vista. Silas had loved the long, soft view toward the coastal range vanished behind an industrial curtain. Heavy machinery growled and belched diesel on the far side of that curtain from first light, a constant mechanical reminder that the world the Rookers had built was now surrounded on every side by men who wanted it gone. Any of it might have broken a lesser woman or at least sent her limping toward the negotiating table. It did neither to Opal Rooker. She hired a licensed surveyor out of Salem, a meticulous professional with no ties to the developers, and had the property lines re-established and driven with fresh iron stakes and bright orange caps, each corner photographed and documented. She drove her tractor precisely when the work required it, exemptions be damned. And she tended the heritage block with a care that deepened, if anything, under the pressure, as though the trees could sense the siege and drew comfort from the steadiness of her hands among their branches. There was a reason the old woman refused to bend that season beyond mere stubbornness, and it was ripening on the southern slope. The Rookers' crimson trees were having a banner year, the finest she had seen in a decade. The clusters hung so dense and dark that some of the lower branches had to be propped with cedar poles to keep them from splitting under the weight, and the fruit carried a depth of color that told her experienced eye the tannins had come in exactly right. Word of it had traveled as word of extraordinary things does among the small, obsessive world of craft cider. A prestigious cider house out of Seattle, one that had built its reputation on single varietal releases that sold out within hours of announcement, had been courting Opal for 2 seasons. Now with the crimson at its peak, they sent their head cider maker down to walk the rows, and the man had gone quiet in the particular way of a professional, encountering something better than he had let himself hope for. Before he left, he laid a preliminary agreement on Opal's kitchen table and offered to purchase the entire heritage harvest at a figure that would not merely sustain the farm, but secure its future for the next decade. Husband or no husband, taxes or no taxes. Opal signed her half that same evening. Silas's reading glasses still sitting on the windowsill, where she had never been able to move them, and for the first time since the fences went up, she slept the whole night through. She did not know that her signature had lit a fuse. She did not know that Dalton Marsh, watching the farm through the glass wall of the newly completed model home he had built on the ridge overlooking her land, had seen the Seattle cider maker's vehicle come and go, had made his inquiries, and had learned that the old woman's finances were about to become bulletproof at the exact moment Marsh Thornton could least afford it. Marsh was drowning, though he wore his suits too well for anyone to see the water rising. His contractors sat idle, their equipment leased by the day, whether or not it moved a single yard of earth. The investors underwriting Phase 3 had begun asking pointed questions about the timeline, and the honest answer, which Marsh would never give them, was that the entire section had stalled against 40 immovable acres. He needed the southern 12 to lay the main sewage and utility trunk lines for the whole development. The heritage block sat directly atop the only viable route. Every alternative his engineers modeled required boring the mains through a shelf of solid bedrock, a solution that would devour millions in additional cost and set the project back a full year. A year Marsh did not have because the investors he had lately begun to understand were not the patient sort. Opal caught only glimpses of the man's mounting desperation. A figure on a distant balcony, a black SUV idling too long at the end of the drive, but she felt the shape of it, the way an old sailor feels a change in the barometer he cannot yet name. She mentioned her unease one afternoon to the only neighbor left, who still farmed rather than developed, Loretta Price, a leather-tough woman in her 60s, who kept horses down the road and had buried a husband of her own. Loretta leaned on the gate rail, watching Opal work a graft with a knife older than either of them, her mouth set in a hard line. That man up on the ridge looks at your place the way a coyote looks at a chicken run, Opal. You watch yourself. Fellows like him don't lose. They just wait until you're not looking. Opal did not glance up from the delicate cut she was making, joining new life to old wood, with a precision Silas had drilled into her hands until she could perform it in the dark. A coyote only gets the chickens if the farmer's forgotten how to shoot, she answered, and there was no boast in it, only the plain assurance of a woman who had spent 72 years learning that patience was a weapon most predators never bothered to respect. I've been outweighted by frost and drought, and worse than either. I don't intend to be outweighted by a boy in a nice suit. But Opal, for all her hard-won wisdom, had made a single miscalculation, the same one honest people have made since the world began. She assumed her adversary shared some baseline understanding of what could and could not be done. She assumed there were lines a man in Dalton Marsh's position would not cross, if only out of fear of the consequences. She assumed, in short, that Marsh was playing the same game she was, merely from the opposite side of the board. Dalton Marsh had stopped playing that game weeks earlier. Cornered by his investors, humiliated by his stalled timeline, enraged by the news of the Seattle contract that would put the old woman permanently beyond the reach of financial pressure, Marsh had begun searching for a different kind of solution entirely, and he had found one hiding in the gray margins of subcontracting law. It was in its way elegant. It rested on a principle that had served ruthless men for generations. It is easier to obtain forgiveness than permission, and cheaper still when the thing you have destroyed cannot be undestroyed. The scheme took shape in the privacy of his mind before he dared speak it aloud, even to himself. Suppose an independent land clearing crew operating from maps that were simply wrong were to cross the property line by mistake. Suppose that crew flattened the disputed acreage before anyone with authority could intervene. Marsh Thornton would express profound and public regret. They would blame a surveying error, a mislabeled document, a subcontractor's careless read of a topographical map. They would absorb a modest county fine for property damage, perhaps, write the widow a check for the value of the wood as firewood, and by the time the dust had settled and the lawyers had been summoned, the 12 acres would already be flat dead and ready for pipe. The obstacle would cease to exist. The penalty would amount to pocket change against a development worth hundreds of millions. It was a cold and precise piece of arithmetic, and Dalton Marsh, who had spent his entire career reducing living things to numbers on a spreadsheet, could find no flaw in it. He calculated the fine. He calculated the firewood settlement. He calculated the investor's relief. He did not calculate the one variable that would ultimately bury him, because he had never bothered to learn it existed, and it was the single most expensive omission of his life. It would prove to be the gravest mistake Dalton Marsh would ever make. The instrument of that mistake was a man named Earl Boone. Boone ran an excavation and land clearing outfit out of a gravel yard on the far side of the county, a gruff, heavy-set operator who had spent 30 years feeding his family by asking no questions so long as the invoices cleared. He was not a cruel man precisely, but he was an incurious one, and incuriosity in the hands of the ruthless is very nearly the same thing as cruelty. When Marsh brought him the job, Boone saw only a contract for clearing brush and grubbing stumps off a designated parcel, the kind of work he had done 1,000 times. He did not ask why the parcel's boundaries on Marsh's freshly printed map sat oddly against the surveyor's stakes he could see with his own eyes when he drove out to scout the site. He noticed the discrepancy. He simply chose not to make it his problem. Marsh had timed everything with the patience of a man who had learned to hunt by watching hawks. He knew Opal Rooker's routines the way a burglar learns a household's, and he had marked one particular obligation on his private calendar in red. The old woman had a cardiologist in Portland, a specialist who monitored a heart that had labored through 72 hard years and one shattering loss, and she had a standing appointment that would take her off the property for the better part of 6 hours. Marsh had confirmed the date through a receptionist who thought she was helping a concerned relative. He had chosen his morning, and he had chosen it well. It fell on a Tuesday in late October, a day so clear and cold that the whole valley seemed carved from glass. The air carried the sweet fermenting tang of windfall apples, decaying gently in the wet grass, mingled with the mineral smell of the first real frost. Opal rose in the dark as she always did, worked through her morning chores by lantern light, and lingered longer than she meant to among the crimson trees, running her palm along a familiar trunk the way another woman might touch a photograph. Something in her did not want to leave the place that morning, a formless reluctance she attributed to nothing more than an old woman's dislike of doctors. She locked the farmhouse, though she rarely bothered, and drove her battered pickup down the drive. At the road, she lifted 2 fingers off the wheel to Loretta Price, who was already out among her horses in the pale early light, her breath and theirs steaming in the cold. Loretta raised a hand in return. Neither of them knew it was a warning gone unspoken, a last quiet moment before the day broke open. Opal turned toward the highway, and her taillights crested the ridge and disappeared, and the farm lay open and undefended behind her. Dalton Marsh had been watching for exactly that. Scarcely 20 minutes after the old woman's truck vanished over the rise, the machinery came. 3 enormous D9 bulldozers, their yellow paint the color of caution signs, an infection rolled off the Cedar Hollow staging ground in a slow diesel procession, flanked by a pair of tracked excavators, whose hydraulic arms folded against their bodies like the legs of monstrous insects. They did not slow at the property line. They struck the chain-link boundary fence at a steady grind and pressed through it, folding the steel posts flat into the mud, like so many blades of grass tearing the green privacy slats to bright confetti that scattered across the drowned northern pasture. Earl Boone rode in the lead machine, a topographical map spread across his knee that Marsh had handed him that morning, a map on which the property line had been dragged a full 12 acres deep into Opal Rooker's land. Marsh gave the order from the climate-controlled comfort of his office on the ridge, his voice crackling over the 2-way radio with the flat detachment of a man ordering lunch. Clear it all. Grub the stumps clean, push the brush into slash piles, for burning, flatten the grade. They would be pouring gravel by the following morning. Boone acknowledged the instructions, set the radio down, and lifted his hand to the operators waiting behind him. The steel jaws of the excavators descended toward the heritage block, and for the first time in 50 years, the southern slope shook with something other than wind. These were not ordinary trees, and they did not die like ordinary trees. They were massive ancient organisms, their trunks grown thick as oil drums, their roots driven deep into half a century of soil the Rookers had fed and mended and prayed over. But no living thing, however old, however loved, is a match for hydraulic steel. The first machine reached the nearest Rooker's crimson and closed its jaws around the trunk, and the century-old rootstock beneath 50 years of Silas's grafting snapped with a report like a rifle shot rolling across the valley. The canopy came down all at once, heavy with ripe dark fruit, and the apples burst against the churning tracks in a shower of red pulp and sweet wasted juice. The entire vintage the Seattle cider maker had traveled south to secure, crushed into pulp in the space of a single breath. For 4 unbroken hours the machines worked, and the sound carried for miles, a groaning, splintering mechanical roar that brought Loretta Price to her fence line, down the road, one hand pressed to her mouth. The crew did not merely cut the trees, they uprooted them entirely, the excavators tearing the delicate grafted root systems from the earth and heaping them into vast, tangled mounds of shattered wood-torn leaves and ruined fruit. The small weathered tags Silas had wired to the branches, each one hand-marked with the identity of a rare genetic cross. Some of them irreplaceable, Some of them, the only record of a lineage that existed nowhere else on the planet, were ground into the churned mud beneath the treads and lost. 50 years of a marriage's most patient work, unmade in an afternoon. By 2 o'clock, the 12-acre heritage block had ceased to exist. Where a living green cathedral had stood at dawn, there was now only a raw brown scar of torn earth scored with the deep parallel wounds of bulldozer tracks. The murdered trees piled in the center of the desolation like corpses awaiting a pyre. The clean, cold smell of frost and fermenting apples had been replaced by the choking reek of diesel exhaust and pulverized sap, the odor of a slaughter. Loretta Price was already reaching for her phone. Opal received the call at 15 minutes past 2. Just as she was steering the pickup back up her own gravel drive, the doctor's reassurances about her heart still fresh in her ears. Loretta's voice reached her fractured by a poor connection, and worse fear, the words tumbling out faster than the signal could carry them. They were on her land, the machines, the southern slope was gone. She did not remember dropping the phone. She did not remember flooring the accelerator, though the engine's sudden roar and the fishtail of gravel behind her told the story afterward. She brought the truck to a sliding halt at the top of the drive and did not bother to shift it into park, leaving it idling and half open as she ran an old woman's legs, remembering how to run for the first time in a decade, her boots hammering the frozen ground as she crested the ridge that overlooked the southern block. She stopped as though she had struck a wall. The breath went out of Opal Rooker in a single involuntary rush punched from her lungs by the sight below her. Where the lush, dark canopy of the heritage block had crowned the slope at sunrise, there was now only barren, tortured ground. The deep tread marks chewed through the soil in overlapping arcs. The beautiful twisted trunks of the Arkansas blacks and the ancient Huey's crabs lay heaped like refuse in the center of the field roots, clawing at the empty sky waiting to be burned. The crimson was gone. All of it. 50 years and Silas's whole life's work lay smashed and rotting in a pile. Something in the old woman's legs gave way, and she went down hard onto her knees in the cold mud at the ridge's edge. The pain that seized her chest in that moment had nothing to do with the heart her cardiologist had just pronounced fit for another decade. It was a deeper failure, a tearing loose of something that had anchored her to the world. She drove her fingers into the torn earth and gripped a fistful of the ruined soil, and a sound came out of her that she did not recognize as her own, a low, jagged animal sob, because it felt exactly as though Silas had died a second time. They had not merely killed her trees, they had severed the last living thread that still bound her to her husband, and they had done it while she sat in a waiting room reading a magazine about golf. Through the roaring fog of that grief, the crunch of tires on frozen ground made her lift her head. Dalton Marsh's black SUV was rolling slowly across the freshly leveled earth, picking its way over the wreckage with obscene care, and it came to a stop a few yards from the kneeling old woman. Marsh stepped out, flanked by Earl Boone, whose face carried something Marsh's did not, a flicker of a man beginning to understand he had helped do a terrible thing. Marsh looked at the devastation, then down at the broken figure in the mud, and arranged his features into a mask of exaggerated, hollow concern. Mrs. Rooker. Oh, Mrs. Rooker, this is a catastrophe. A terrible, terrible misunderstanding. Marsh advanced with his hands raised in a pantomime of helplessness, his voice dripping a sympathy that did not reach the cold calculation behind his eyes. There had been, he explained, a devastating error with the surveyor's maps. His subcontractor had crossed the boundary by mistake. He was sick over it. Truly sick. Opal rose to her feet slowly, her knees trembling, her hands black to the wrist with wet soil, and she said only 4 words torn out of her in a cracked whisper. You destroyed it all. Marsh had come prepared. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored coat and produced a check already filled out, and he held it toward the old woman with the air of a man conferring a generosity. He understood, he said, that the trees had held sentimental value. But legally speaking, agricultural timber was valued by the court as firewood, and he had taken the liberty of having an assessor run the numbers on standard applewood. He was prepared to offer $15,000 for the loss, plus the cost of reseeding grass over the scar. A generous gesture, he suggested, for an honest mistake. And at the very corner of his mouth, there sat a smile so small it was almost invisible, the smile of a man who believed he had already won, who saw before him only a defeated old widow and a problem finally cheaply solved. Opal did not look at the check. She looked past Dalton Marsh's outstretched hand toward the slash pile, toward a single shattered branch jutting from the tangle of ruined wood, and toward the small weather-beaten metal tag, still wired to it, stamped with an identification number issued by the National Clonal Germplasm Repository. She looked at that tag for a long moment while the wind moved across the wounded field, and something happened inside her that Dalton Marsh, for all his cunning, did not have the wisdom to recognize as the most dangerous thing that could occur. The grief did not leave her. It simply changed its state the way water hardens into ice under a hard enough freeze. The tears dried on her face. The trembling in her hands stilled itself, and when she wiped her palms clean against the thighs of her jeans and straightened her spine to its full 72-year height, the woman who looked into Dalton Marsh's eyes was no longer weeping. She was calculating with an ancient and terrible patience. "You think what you smashed today was timber, Mr. Marsh?" Opal's voice came out level and quiet, emptied of the sorrow that had racked it moments before, and the sudden calm of it unsettled Marsh more than any scream could have. "You think you cut down some old fruit wood? Good for smoking a brisket, maybe." Marsh frowned, thrown off his script, the check still hanging in the cold air between them. He allowed that yes, that was more or less his understanding of the matter. Opal turned her back on the man and walked toward her idling truck, unhurried now, every movement deliberate. Marsh called after her, an edge of irritation finally cracking through the polished sympathy, warning the old woman to be reasonable, promising that any lawsuit would be dragged through civil court until she was too dead to see the end of it, urging her one last time to take the $15,000 and be done. Opal opened the door of her truck and paused, looking back over her shoulder across the ruin of everything she and Silas had built, and when she spoke, the words landed with the weight of a sentence handed down. "You did not cut down firewood today, Mr. Marsh. You trespassed onto private ground, and you destroyed a federally registered botanical genetics bank." She let that settle, watch the first flicker of uncertainty cross the younger man's face. "Before this is finished, you are going to wish you had never once heard the name Rooker." She climbed into the truck, pulled the door shut with a solid final sound, and drove back toward the farmhouse, leaving Dalton Marsh standing alone in the churned mud of his own making, the $15,000 check fluttering uselessly from his fingers in the rising autumn wind. Marsh did not yet understand what he had done. He believed he had won a difficult day. He did not know that the quiet old woman now disappearing up the drive was not going to reach for a shotgun, nor even at first for a lawyer. She was going to reach into an iron safe beneath a study rug and pull out an instrument of agricultural law so old and so ruthless that it would transform Marsh Thornton's tidy little surveying error into the most devastating financial reckoning the state of Oregon had ever witnessed. The obstacle Dalton Marsh thought he had cleared was about to become the thing that buried him, and the burying had only just begun. The farmhouse door closed behind Opal Rooker with a sound smaller than the one her truck door had made on the ridge, but it sealed something far larger than a doorway. She crossed the front room in the failing October light, without reaching for a lamp, past the cold wood stove, where the developer's beach house brochures had turned to ash months before, past the windowsill where Silas's reading glasses still caught the day's last light. She did not weep again. She had spent that grief out in the open air above the wreckage, and what remained in her now was colder, harder, and far more useful to a woman who intended to make someone pay. In the study, she rolled back the braided rug she and Silas had bought on their honeymoon, worked the dial of the heavy iron floor safe from memory, and lifted out a thick manila folder that had waited in the dark for precisely this hour. She set it beneath the green banker's lamp and opened it the way a surgeon opens a chest, unhurried, certain of everything inside. There lay the germplasm registry certificates, embossed and countersigned by a federal hand. There lay the private cidery contracts, including the fresh Seattle agreement, now rendered meaningless by a heap of pulped fruit rotting on the southern slope. There lay Silas's careful seasonal photographs of the heritage block, the trees heavy in September, bare and silver in January, and beneath them the yellowing spine of the ledger in which 5 decades of graphs survived in ink even after the trees themselves had been ground into the mud. Opal rested her palm flat on that ledger for a long moment, the way a woman lays her hand on a coffin lid. Then she drew out a small spiral notebook, uncapped a pen, and began to make a list. Grief, she was learning, when refined and given somewhere to go, burns hotter than any furnace a person can build. Sleep did not come to her that night, nor did she seek it. She sat at the kitchen table until the sky bruised from black toward gray, cataloging from memory. Every tree that had stood on the block, every varietal, every graft line, checking her own recollection against the ledger's records, and finding with grim satisfaction that the two agreed down to the letter. Silas had taught her the ledger the way he had taught her the knife, patiently across 40 years, and now that patience became a weapon in her hands. By the time the frost lifted off the ruined earth, she had assembled the one thing Dalton Marsh had never dreamed the old woman possessed: a complete, documented, defensible inventory of exactly what had been destroyed, and exactly what it had once been worth. A woman who keeps records, Opal thought keeps power. A woman who trusts her memory alone leaves the door open for liars. She did not drive toward the glass towers of downtown Portland the next morning, where the developer's own attorneys nested like well-fed birds. She had asked Loretta Price a single question across the fence at dawn, and Loretta had given her a single name along with the observation that the man in question had once made an entire timber company weep in open court. Opal steered her battered pickup instead toward an older quarter of the city, past the polished corporate lobbies, until she found a weathered brick building with a hand-lettered directory in its entrance, and on the second floor behind a frosted glass door, the office of Sawyer Ellison, attorney at law. Ellison was nothing the movies had trained anyone to expect of a litigator who won large. He was a lean, silver-haired man past 60, reading glasses shoved up into his hair, his desk buried under case files rather than crowded with trophies. He had built his entire career in the unglamorous trenches of agricultural disputes, water rights, and timber law, and he had turned down the big firms 3 separate times across 4 decades because the big firms represented the men who bulldozed things, and Sawyer Ellison had discovered as a young man that he could only sleep at night representing the ground beneath the blades. He understood the language of soil as fluently as he understood the Oregon Revised Statutes, which meant he understood both far better than nearly anyone else alive in the state. Opal did not sit. She set the manila folder on the mahogany desk, then placed beside it a small burlap sack, drawing from it a handful of the ruined rooker's crimson apples she had gathered from the wreckage. At first light, their skins split their dark flesh already browning, their sweet ferment filling the cramped office with the smell of a harvest that would never reach a press. She laid out the facts without wasting a syllable. Marsh Thornton had bulldozed her southern block, all 12 acres, every proprietary graft, every century-old rootstock. They had left her a check for $15,000, calling the whole thing an accidental timber trespass. She wanted them stopped, but stopping was not nearly enough. "I did not drive up here to be made whole, Mr. Ellison. No one walks whole away from a thing like this. I came to be certain that the afternoon they took from me becomes the most expensive one of their entire lives." Ellison did not answer at once. He opened the folder, and as he turned the pages, his posture shifted. By slow degrees, a man leaning imperceptibly forward, the way an old hound lifts its head at a scent it has waited years to catch again. He examined the registry certificates. He read the Cornell correspondence tucked into the ledger letters from researchers who had made the drive south simply to study the crimson. He studied the Seattle contract, marked the figure at the bottom, let a slow breath escape through his nose. When at last he looked up, his eyes carried a light Opal recognized instantly because the same cold fire had kindled in her own chest the previous afternoon, kneeling in the churned soil. "Mrs. Rooker, I need to ask you one thing, and I need you to answer it precisely. When these people crossed onto your land, did any person connected to that firm actually admit the line was crossed on purpose, or that they knew whose ground they were tearing up?" Opal thought of Marsh standing in the mud with his rehearsed sorrow and his ready check. The senior man drove out personally, stood in the middle of the ruin, called it a surveyor's mistake, smiled while he said it, then tried to buy my silence with firewood money before the diesel had cleared the air. A slow, predatory smile spread across Sawyer Ellison's weathered face, the first genuinely pleased expression he had worn in months. "Then your Mr. Marsh has made an error so large I doubt he can yet see the edges of it." He rose, crossed to a bookshelf sagging under bound volumes of statute, drew one down without checking the spine. "He believes he is looking at ordinary property damage. A fence knocked flat a few trees, lost a small nuisance settlement to be haggled down over a lazy year. What he does not grasp is that he chose the wrong state to do this in. Oregon was built on timber, Mrs. Rooker, and the men who built it wrote laws with teeth in them precisely because they knew what powerful outfits do to small landholders when they think nobody important is watching." He opened the volume to a page he had plainly visited many times, turned it so his visitor could read the heading. Oregon Revised Statute 105.810. The Timber Trespass Statute. Ellison tapped it with a blunt finger. "Under this law, when a person willfully without lawful authority cuts down or injures or carries off the trees of another, the wrong party is not merely owed the value of what was lost. The court is required to triple it. Treble damages as a matter of statute, not of a judge's mercy. Whatever a jury decides those trees were worth, the judgment multiplies by 3. The lawmakers meant it to sting. They meant it to sting badly enough that a company would think twice before deciding a lone woman's orchard was cheaper to flatten than to road around." Opal absorbed this in silence, and something in her weathered face settled not toward joy, which she was far too grieved to feel, but toward a granite resolve. "Then the only question left standing," she answered quietly, "is what a jury believes my husband's life's work was worth. And I do not intend to let a man in a Portland suit stand up and tell 12 strangers it was worth a cord of applewood." That Ellison agreed was precisely the ground on which the war would be fought, the only ground that mattered. The statute would triple whatever figure the court arrived at, but the figure itself had to be established first, then defended against a corporate defense that would fight tooth nail and billable hour to keep it small. 15,000 tripled was still pocket lint to a firm like Marsh Thornton. The entire campaign, the lawyer explained, would turn on valuation, and valuation was a science one, demanding an expert whose credentials no defense attorney could sneer away in front of a jury of valley folk. Ellison made 3 telephone calls that afternoon, while Opal waited in a hard wooden chair, and the third connected him to a name that carried real weight in the narrow, obsessive world where botany met the courtroom. Dr. Nathaniel Frame held a forensic pomology chair at Cornell, a specialist who had spent his career assigning defensible dollar figures to destroyed trees in cases exactly like this one, and who nursed a particular, almost personal contempt for the careless annihilation of rare genetic material. When Ellison described what had grown on the Rooker block, then described what had been done to it in a single afternoon, Frame fell quiet on the line, then said he would rearrange his entire semester and be on a plane inside the week. Some things, he told the lawyer, a scientist did not simply bill for by the hour. Some things a scientist counted as a duty owed to the living world. But Dalton Marsh had not passed the intervening days in idleness, nor had he any intention of granting the old woman a clean run at the courthouse steps. Word of Opal's visit to a known agricultural litigator reached the Ridgetop model home with unsettling speed, carried by the loose talk of a small county in Marsh. Sensing his tidy little firewood settlement curdling into something with teeth, opened a second front one, engineered to hollow out the case before Ellison could finish building it. The first blow struck at the Seattle contract, which Marsh understood correctly to be the beating heart of any future claim for lost revenue. If the cider house could be frightened into walking away, the most credible witness to the orchard's worth would vanish with it. So Marsh saw to it that a rumor began to move through the tight, gossiping world of Pacific Northwest cider, a whisper that the Rooker Heritage Block had been quietly riddled with fire blight, that the developers had in truth done the whole region a service by clearing diseased stock before the bacteria could leap to neighboring orchards. It was a poisonous, elegant lie because fire blight was every grower's midnight terror, and the mere breath of it could stain a reputation for years. Within days, the Seattle cider maker, who had shaken Opal's hand over a preliminary agreement, sent a cautious, apologetic message wondering whether they ought to pause things until the situation came clear. Opal read that message standing at her kitchen counter, and for a moment the old fury threatened to boil up into something reckless. Then she set the phone face down on the wood, breathed the way Silas had taught her to breathe when a late cold snap threatened a whole season's bloom, and she did the only thing she had ever known to do against a killing frost. She went to work. She telephoned the State Agricultural Extension Office and demanded a full inspection, not of the destroyed block, which no longer drew breath, but of every remaining living thing on the property, the ornamentals ringing the house, the old cider trees along the lane, the precious propagation stock crowded in her greenhouse. She paid for it out of her own pocket without a flicker of hesitation, then stood at the inspector's shoulder through 2 long days as the woman examined every branch, every bud, every leaf scar. The certification came back without ambiguity. The Rooker property was, and by every available record, always had been entirely free of fire blight. She forwarded the document to Seattle to Sawyer Ellison, then in a stroke of pure cold iron to the county recorder's office, so that the truth would live forever in the public file as a standing rebuke to whoever had authored the lie. It was a victory, but it was the kind that cost a person more than it returns, because it taught her precisely the sort of adversary she faced, one who would poison a reputation as casually as he had ordered a fence, flatten one for whom no falsehood ran too large if it might shave a single zero off the eventual judgment. "A frost you see rolling in off the coast range," Opal told Loretta Price that evening across the fence, her breath clouding in the dark. "You can fight. You light your smudge pots. You run the wind machines. You cover the tender buds. You save the bloom. It's the cold that pretends to be a warm spell, right up until the hour it kills you. That's the one you have to lie awake watching for. I know now exactly which kind of weather that man is." Marsh's second maneuver came quieter and in its way crueler, for it wore the borrowed face of the law itself. A notice arrived from the county assessor's office informing Opal that her property was under reassessment, its agricultural tax deferral suddenly in review on the stated grounds that a substantial portion of the land no longer stood in active agricultural production. The obscene circularity of it took the old woman a full minute to fully absorb. Marsh had bulldozed the orchard into oblivion, and now Marsh's quiet allies among the tax rolls were preparing to punish her for the fact that the bulldozed ground grew nothing. Should the reassessment hold, her tax burden would swell overnight, delivering the very financial squeeze Marsh had promised her on the porch a lifetime ago, now arriving through a bureaucratic side door with a government letterhead. Sawyer Ellison handled that thrust himself with a crisp two-page letter to the assessor, citing the pending litigation, the criminal shadow hanging over the trespass, and the specific statute shielding agricultural deferrals where production had ceased through no fault of the landowner. The reassessment was quietly shelved within the week, but Ellison warned his client sternly against mistaking the reprieve for genuine safety. Understand his purpose, Mrs. Rooker. He is not fighting to win these little skirmishes. He is fighting to bleed you. Every dollar you spend defending your taxes every day, you burn chasing an inspector through your own greenhouse, is $1 in a day you are not spending building the case that can actually destroy him. He wants you exhausted, distracted, drained, and poor. Men like Marsh have learned across their whole careers that most people surrender in the end, not because they were wrong, but simply because they got tired. Opal understood the strategy in her bones because, stripped of its suits and its letterhead, it was the identical strategy the Frost employed. Patience turned into a weapon, attrition, dressed up as inevitability. She simply held one advantage Marsh could never have entered into his calculations. Opal Rooker had spent half a century learning to outlast the things that came each year to kill what she loved, and 4 winters learning to outlast a grief that had tried to kill her too. Patience was not some virtue she was straining to reach for under pressure. It was the only faith she had ever truly kept. There came a third pressure, and this one nearly found its mark because it aimed at the last soft place in the old woman's armor. Loretta Price, who had heard the machines groaning and made the frantic telephone call, was the nearest thing Opal had to a witness of the day itself. A week after the fire blight lie collapsed, 2 men in a company vehicle paid a call at Loretta's own horse farm. Polite men who spoke smoothly of neighborly concern of how unfortunate it would be should her property, which shared an old water easement with the Rooker land, find itself tangled in a long and ruinously expensive lawsuit. They mentioned as if in passing that they understood her hay supplier also did a fair amount of business with Marsh Thornton. They departed without uttering a single threat a recording could have captured, which was, of course, the entire art of it. Loretta came to Opal that evening, and for the first time in the long decades the 2 women had known one another. The leather-tough neighbor looked genuinely shaken. She told Opal everything the men had said, told her she feared nothing for her own hide, but she had grown too old to lose the farm over another person's war. Then she asked, real anguish roughening her voice, whether Opal would think the less of her should she step clear of the whole business. Opal looked at her oldest friend across the kitchen table, where the 2 of them had shared 1,000 cups of coffee through 1,000 hard seasons, and she understood at once that Marsh had located the one pressure point that could genuinely cost her the case, because without Loretta, the timeline of that October Tuesday grew far harder to establish before a jury. She could have pleaded. She could have leaned on 30 years of borrowed tools and shared harvests and favors traded across the fence line. Instead, she reached across the worn tabletop, covered Loretta's weathered hand with her own dirt-seamed one, and gave her the plain truth. You made one telephone call, Loretta, because you watched a living thing being murdered in broad daylight, and you could not stand still for it. That is the whole of what any soul owes this world, and you paid it in full the moment you dialed. If keeping your horses and your home means you stay clear of the rest of this ugliness, then you stay clear with my blessing and my gratitude, and I will not lose one wink of sleep over it. A woman who'd trade a friend's roof to win her own fight has already lost the only part worth winning. It was perhaps the most consequential thing Opal said in the whole long war, though no juror ever heard a word of it. Because Loretta Price, released from all obligations, sat alone with those words overnight, then drove to Sawyer Ellison's office the next morning entirely of her own accord and gave a signed, sworn, time-stamped statement of everything she had seen and heard that October Tuesday, closing it with the dry observation that no man had ever once tried to frighten her off a thing in 60-some years, and she found she was far too old to begin being frightened now. Marsh's intimidation had achieved the perfect opposite of its design. He had hammered a reluctant witness into a resolute one, and he would never so much as suspect that the old widow's refusal to use her friend had accomplished what no subpoena on earth could have forced. While Marsh spent himself on these guerrilla raids around the edges, the true weapon assembled itself methodically on the southern slope, and its name was Dr. Nathaniel Frame. He arrived on a raw November morning, a compact, intense man in his 50s, who moved with the unhurried economy of someone long accustomed to reading evidence that could not be bribed into lying, and he spent 3 full days walking the ruins of the Heritage Block, while the first hard winter rains turned the churned earth to a cold gray soup that sucked at his boots. He refused to be rushed. He photographed every shattered stump exactly where it lay, measured trunk diameters at the ragged breaks, bored cores from the surviving root crowns, to count the growth rings, bagged soil samples from a dozen marked locations matched each destroyed tree, wherever a ground tag had survived the treads, against the entries in Silas's ledger. He worked through the downpour without a word of complaint because, as he confided to Opal over coffee in the farmhouse kitchen on the second evening, he had spent his whole career watching corporations reduce irreplaceable living things to line items on a spreadsheet, and he took a quiet professional pleasure in handing such men a number large enough to teach them regret. What Frame grasped and what he engineered his report to prove beyond the reach of any cross-examination was that the value of the Rooker Heritage Block bore no relationship whatsoever to the price of split firewood stacked by the cord. Ordinary commercial apple trees could be valued by simple replacement cost, so many dollars for a nursery whip, so many seasons to bearing maturity. But the trees Marsh had fed into his machines could not be replaced by any nursery standing on the earth because several of them, the Rooker's Crimson, above all, existed nowhere else in creation. Frame's valuation therefore rose on 3 separate pillars, each independently documented, each a stone Ellison could set squarely in a juror's hand. The first pillar was the replacement cost of the specialized century-old rootstock, the ancient foundations onto which 5 decades of grafts had been joined. Stock that could not merely be ordered, but would have to be sourced, aged, and coaxed to establishment across whole decades no living rooker would ever see repeated. The second pillar was the loss of exclusive genetic intellectual property. The Rooker's Crimson itself, a proprietary registered variety, embodying 30 years of Silas's breeding selection and heartbreak, a living patent ground into the mud alongside the only stock capable of ever propagating it again. The third pillar was projected lost revenue, 20 years of it, from the boutique cidery contracts Opal had already secured or stood in fair position to secure income streams the destruction had strangled dead in their infancy. When Frame ran the calculation on the Crimson alone, applying the accepted forensic methodology for a unique registered income-producing cultivar, he arrived at a figure that made even Sawyer Ellison, who believed he had seen the outer limits of everything, sit back slowly in his chair. A single mature Rooker's Crimson tree frame, concluded on the record, carried a defensible value of $42,000. 110 of them had stood breathing on the block at dawn on that October Tuesday. That single varietal before one Arkansas Black or one Huey's Crab was so much as counted, before the shredded irrigation was tallied, before $1 of soil remediation was added, before the murdered contracts were projected forward, accounted on its own for better than $4.5 million in destroyed value. Frame delivered his complete report in the second week of December, a bound document thick as a city telephone directory. Every claim footnoted, every methodology cited to the literature, every photograph indexed and dated. When the full accounting stood assembled, the Arkansas Blacks and the Huey's Crabs, folded in the ruined drip lines and torn-out infrastructure, valued the soil remediation, estimated the strangled contracts carried forward across 2 decades. The actual documented damages came to $4.8 million. Opal read that final figure in Ellison's office, thought not of the money, but of the sheer count of trees behind it, of the fact that every single dollar stood in for a living organism. Silas had shaped, and she had tended with her own 2 hands, and she felt no triumph at all. Only a heavy, aching vindication that settled in her chest like cold water finding its level. Sawyer Ellison, however, permitted himself a thin, cold smile as he squared the report on his desk. $4.8 million, Mrs. Rooker, is what the trees were worth on the morning of the day he killed them. But Mr. Marsh did not merely lose your trees to some act of God. He willfully sent steel across a line he knew was not his onto ground. he knew belonged to you in the statute I showed you, does not care one whit how sorry he practices looking. He drew a yellow legal pad toward himself, wrote a single line of plain arithmetic, turned it so his client could read every digit. 4.8 multiplied by 3. $14.4 million. That is the number we are going to lay before a Marion County jury, and there is not a dollar of it I cannot defend when they try to tear it down. Opal studied the figure for a long, quiet while. It had ceased, she understood, to be about money in any ordinary sense. The money was merely the language the law happened to speak, the single tongue in which a man like Dalton Marsh could ever be made to comprehend the true enormity of what he had done. He offered me $15,000, she said at last, almost wonderingly, turning the memory over like a stone in her palm. Stood in the wreckage of 50 years, and my husband's whole faith held out $15,000 and smiled while the diesel was still hanging in the air. Before this is done, I mean for him to remember that smile every single morning for the rest of his natural life. They filed in the third week of December in the circuit court for Marion County and Sawyer Ellison, who understood the theater of the law every bit as thoroughly as its substance, made certain the complaint arrived the way a debt comes due on a man who thought himself untouchable. He did not fax it. He did not send it quietly by email to opposing counsel. He engaged a process server, a laconic professional who drove north to Marsh Thornton's gleaming Portland headquarters, walked past the receptionist without breaking his stride, and laid a 200-page legal complaint squarely on the glass desk in Dalton Marsh's corner office, where the developer sat admiring the scale architectural model of the reserve at Cedar Hollow, its tiny mansions and its tiny emerald golf course glowing prettily beneath museum lights. Marsh picked the document up, expecting a nuisance suit, some predictable demand for a few $100,000 that his corporate lawyers would grind down to a fraction over 18 tedious months of motions. He flipped past the caption, past the recitation of facts, hunting for the section that mattered, the demand for relief, and there the color drained out of his tanned face as though a stopper had been pulled from the base of his throat. His breath snagged somewhere beneath his ribs. Opal Rooker was not suing him for $15,000. Opal Rooker was not even suing him for the $4.8 million the trees had been worth. That quiet old widow in the muddy boots, the defeated relic Marsh had smiled at across a field of ruin, was suing Marsh Thornton Holdings for $14.4 million, and the complaint cited a statute Marsh had never heard spoken aloud, attached a Cornell forensic report he could not wave away, and named him Dalton Marsh personally, in his own name, stripped of the corporate veil he had always assumed would shelter him. He telephoned his corporate defense attorney before he had finished reading a hard-nosed litigator named Brett Calloway, who charged like a wounded bull and did not frighten at shadows. Marsh's voice climbed higher than he intended, cracking at its edges, as he insisted the entire thing was a joke, that the plaintiff was nothing but a crazy old widow rattling around 40 acres, that they were nothing but apple trees, for God's sake, that Calloway needed to make it disappear before the board, or worse, the investors caught the scent of that number. Calloway did not answer the way his client desperately wanted him to. A long silence stretched across the line, the sound of a seasoned professional actually reading the filing that had just been forwarded to him. And when at last he spoke, his voice had shed its customary swagger, entirely gone flat and grim in a way that chilled Marsh more thoroughly than any shouting could have. Dalton, I need you to listen to me very carefully, because I am only going to walk you through this one time. I cannot make this go away. I have read the complaint start to finish. They hold federal registry documents establishing this was a protected biodiversity site under law. They have a forensic valuation authored by a sitting Cornell chair that will outlast any expert I could scrape up to stand against it. And they filed under the Oregon Timber Trespass statute, which means the instant they persuade 12 jurors, this was willful, that number triples by the plain operation of law, and there is not one single motion I can file that stops it from happening. Marsh began to protest, began again to say it was a surveying error, an honest subcontractor's mistake, but Calloway cut clean through him, and what the lawyer said next dropped into the pit of the developer's stomach like a swallowed stone going down. You had better pray, Dalton, and I mean pray, that you can prove to a jury this was a genuine accident, that not one soul in your organization knew whose land that was or sent that crew across the line on purpose. Because if there exists so much as one text message, one email, one wire transfer, one witness who can look 12 people in the eye and testify that you knew, then this stops being property damage in an instant. It becomes the willful destruction of a federally registered asset, The statute triples it without mercy, and this company does not have $14 million in liquid cash sitting in any account I have ever seen. You did not bulldoze some trees off a widow's back 40. You bulldozed a living patent, and the woman who kept it is not the sort who goes away. The news spread through Marsh Thornton with the speed of flame racing through August grass. The board of directors convened an emergency session behind closed doors and emerged from it visibly shaken, several of them no longer meeting Marsh's eyes in the hallway. But the truly fatal stroke, the one that transformed a frightening lawsuit into an outright existential crisis, arrived from the investors underwriting Phase 3. The impatient men whose pointed questions Marsh had been dodging and deflecting for the better part of a year. They did not wait to see how the litigation might unspool. The mere existence of a $14 million exposure, one personally naming a senior director of the firm, hanging over a development already badly behind its promised schedule, was a greater risk than their patience could stomach. Within a week of the complaint landing on that glass desk, the Phase 3 financing froze solid pending resolution of the suit. The capital that kept the whole vast development breathing abruptly silently choked off at the source. Marsh stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his ridgetop model home, in the failing light of the year's last days, staring down across the darkened valley toward the single warm square of a farmhouse window where an old woman he had tried his level best to erase from the earth sat reading a Cornell report by lamplight. The idle construction cranes on the Cedar Hollow site stood frozen against the winter sky, halted mid-reach like the arms of men caught in the act. And for the first time in a gilded career, Dalton Marsh felt the ground he had always assumed was bedrock shift and slide beneath his expensive shoes. He had calculated the county fine. He had calculated the firewood settlement. He had calculated the investor's gratitude and the pipeline's route and the profit on every faux farmhouse mansion. He had calculated everything on earth except the single variable Sawyer Ellison had spotted within the first 10 minutes of the first afternoon. The one terrible fact the old woman had known all along and kept locked in cold iron beneath a study rug, that in the state of Oregon, the law prices a murdered orchard at 3 times its worth, and that Opal Rooker had never once for the space of a single heartbeat intended to settle. Down in the farmhouse, Opal closed the heavy report, set it on the table beside Silas's reading glasses, where they still kept their patient vigil, and looked out through the dark glass toward the frozen scar on the southern slope where a marriage's life's work had stood only weeks before. The trial itself lay months ahead across the whole long, cold belly of winter. The hardest fight of all, the one that would decide whether 12 strangers believed the destruction was a careless accident or a calculated killing, had not yet even begun. Somewhere out there, bound up in a crew that had asked no questions, and a foreman who had plainly noticed the survey stakes stood wrong, lay a single buried truth that could triple everything or collapse it into nothing. Opal did not yet know how she would drag that truth into the light of a courtroom. She knew only with the settled and terrible certainty of a woman who has already lost everything the world can take from her, that she had planted this fight in exactly the right soil, and that she fully intended to be standing on her own 2 feet when it finally came to harvest. Winter loosened its hold on the Willamette Valley by slow degrees that year, the way an old grief learns at last to sit quieter in the chest, and by the time a green haze of new buds softened the surviving trees along Opal Rooker's lane, the slow machinery of the law had ground its way toward a reckoning. The trial was set to open in the Marion County Courthouse in Salem, a solid stone building whose corridors had absorbed a century of quarrels over water timber, and the oldest question the valley knew, which was, who truly owns the ground a person stands upon? Opal drove down the evening before, took a plain room in a motel she could have purchased outright, and lay awake through most of the dark hours. Not from fear, but from the hollow awareness that come morning she would finally speak aloud under oath, the thing that had lived unspoken in her since October. The gallery filled past its comfortable capacity on the opening morning. Word had traveled through every feed store, Grange Hall, and church basement in the region, and the benches packed themselves shoulder to shoulder with precisely the people Marsh Thornton had spent years buying out or fencing off. Small orchardists in pressed Sunday shirts sat beside independent cider makers who had closed their tasting rooms for the day to attend. Farmers who had driven 3 hours before dawn wedged in next to agricultural advocates, scribbling on notepads. Against that weathered wall of witnesses sat the sweating executives of the developer in their fine tailoring, come to learn whether the company signing their paychecks was about to be lowered into the ground. Neither camp spoke a word across the aisle. The air between the two sides felt dense enough to lean a person's whole weight against. Presiding over it all sat the Honorable Cordelia Hargrove, a lean, sharp-featured jurist with 3 decades on the bench, a woman whose reputation for despising corporate arrogance was rivaled only by her intolerance for anyone foolish enough to imagine they might manage her courtroom for her. Every attorney in the state had heard how she once jailed a Fortune 500 defendant for contempt merely for smirking through a plaintiff's testimony. When she took her seat, let her gaze travel slowly across the crowded gallery, a silence descended that no bailiff was required to enforce. Opal sat at the plaintiff's table in a plain gray wool suit that had last drawn air at Silas's funeral. Her spine as straight as a well-set fence post, her weathered hands folded and still on the polished wood. Sawyer Ellison sat at her side, unhurried, his files squared before him, like a farmer's tools laid out for a long day's work. Across the aisle, Dalton Marsh occupied the defendant's chair, and the change in the man was the first quiet satisfaction of Opal's morning. The arrogant gleam had guttered out of him entirely. In its place sat the pale, sunken look of a man who had not slept a full night in months, who watched every juror file into the box, as though each carried a portion of his sentence already written. Brett Calloway opened for the defense with the smooth, unshakable confidence of a lawyer who has decided that confidence itself will be his strongest evidence. He walked the jury patiently through a story of ordinary human error, of a busy development of overlapping contractors, of a topographical map that had, through nobody's malice, misrepresented a property line. His client, he explained, had relied in good faith upon the maps furnished to him as any reasonable businessman would. The clearing of the disputed acreage had been a genuine tragedy, yes, a regrettable accident that Marsh Thornton had moved at once to remedy with a fair and generous offer. The $15,000 check, Calloway assured them, reflected the standard industry valuation for accidentally cleared agricultural timber, a good faith gesture from a company sick at heart over an honest blunder. The treble damages statute, he stressed gently reasonably, was written for willful acts of malice, for thieves and vandals, not for an innocent mapping mistake. To triple these damages would be to punish a company for a clerical error as though it were a crime. It was a solid defense delivered with genuine skill, and Opal watched several jurors nod along at the fundamental fairness of it. She understood in that moment with a cold clarity exactly how much ground Ellison would have to win back. To unlock the multiplier, they had to prove that Dalton Marsh had knowingly, deliberately ordered steel across a line he understood perfectly well was not his to clear a path for his sewer trunk lines. They needed more than the widow's word against the developers. They needed something no juror could explain away as an accident. They needed a smoking gun, and for the first 2 days of trial, they did not appear to have one. Ellison built his case the way a stonemason builds a wall, patiently, course by course, letting the weight of it accumulate. He called the surveyor from Salem, who testified that he had personally reestablished and driven bright iron stakes at every corner of the Rooker property line months before the clearing, that those stakes were plainly visible, freshly capped in orange, impossible for any competent operator to miss. He called Loretta Price, who took the stand with her chin lifted, and told the jury, in the plain, unhurried speech of a woman who had spent 60 years telling the truth to livestock and neighbors alike, exactly what she had seen and heard. That October Tuesday, the machines breaching the fence, the trees going down like rifle fire rolling across the valley. When Calloway rose to suggest delicately that an elderly woman at a distance might have been confused about property lines, Loretta fixed him with a look that had cowed stallions. "Young man, I have lived on the far side of that fence for 41 years. I know where Opal Rooker's land ends the way I know where my own skin ends. There was no confusion in that field. There was only murder." Then Ellison called Dr. Nathaniel Frame, and the second day of trial became a quiet slaughter, though not the kind Marsh had come expecting. Frame took the jury through his methodology with the calm authority of a man who has never once been successfully contradicted, laying out the 3 pillars of his valuation: the irreplaceable century-old rootstock, the exclusive genetic patent embodied in the Rooker's crimson, the 2 decades of strangled cidery revenue. He explained in language a valley jury understood in their bones why these were not firewood, why a tree bred across 30 years and registered as a living genetic bank could no more be replaced by a nursery whip than a woman's late husband could be replaced by a stranger. He set the number before them, $42,000 for a single mature crimson, 110 of them gone in an afternoon, and he made every dollar of it feel not like greed, but like grief given a figure. Callaway had prepared for this. The defense had retained its own expert, a valuation consultant named Garrett Cole, a polished man who arrived with impressive-looking charts and a manner of gentle condescension, and who testified that Frame's numbers were wildly inflated, that no apple tree on earth was worth $42,000, that a reasonable replacement valuation put the entire block at perhaps $200,000, generous already against the firewood offer. For a stretch of the afternoon, watching Cole's confident charts, Opal felt the case tilt, felt the jury's sympathy for the developer's version of reasonableness begin to reassert itself. Then Sawyer Ellison rose for cross-examination, and he did not raise his voice once. He asked Cole mildly whether he had ever personally valued a federally registered proprietary cultivar before. Cole allowed that this was his first. He asked whether Cole had reviewed the National Clonal Germplasm Repository certification. Cole admitted he had not been provided it. He asked whether Cole's replacement valuation accounted for the simple fact that the replacement stock did not exist anywhere in the world, that one could not purchase at any price, a thing that had been rendered extinct. Cole faltered. Ellison walked to his table, retrieved a single sheet, then asked the consultant to read aloud the price the man's own firm had assigned in an unrelated matter 3 years prior to a single registered proprietary grapevine destroyed by a pipeline. Cole's face changed color as he read the figure into the record. $38,000 for one vine. So your own firm, Ellison observed almost kindly, folding the paper away, has already sworn under oath that a single irreplaceable registered plant can be worth nearly $40,000 in a case where you were paid by the plaintiff. Yet here, where you are paid by the men who did the destroying 110 irreplaceable registered trees, are worth altogether $200,000. Help the jury understand which of your two numbers we are meant to believe. Cole had no answer that survived the silence. The defense's valuation collapsed on the stand, and with it the developer's last comfortable illusion that this would be a fight about firewood. Still, valuation was only half the war, and the smaller half. Frame had proven what the trees were worth. He had not proven the destruction was willful, and without willfulness, the terrible multiplier stayed locked in its statute in $4.8 million. However staggering was a wound Marsh Thornton might yet survive through years of appeal. As the second day closed, Opal understood that everything, the whole harvest of her patience, still hung on a single unproven thread. Someone had to place in that courtroom the knowledge that Marsh had known. Ellison had subpoenaed records, had chased phone logs and permits, but the developer had been careful, had kept his fingerprints off the paper. The smoking gun, if it existed at all, lived inside the memory of one man. That man was Earl Boone, and Marsh Thornton had made the single gravest tactical error of the entire defense in the way they chose to treat him. Desperate to sever the corporation from any hint of intent, Callaway's strategy had settled on pinning the whole catastrophe upon the subcontractor painting Boone as a careless operator who had misread a map and blundered across a line no one had told him to cross. In the weeks before trial, the developer had quietly moved to cancel. Boone's remaining contracts had let it be known through intermediaries that the excavation company would bear the county fines had begun, in short, to feed Earl Boone to the wolves to save its own hide. Boone was a gruff and curious man who had spent 30 years asking no questions, so long as the invoices cleared, but he was not a stupid one, and he was not a man who took kindly to being made another's scapegoat. Watching Marsh Thornton maneuver to lay the ruin of a widow's orchard and the destruction of his own livelihood entirely at his feet, something in Earl Boone hardened into a decision. When Sawyer Ellison's investigator came calling with a careful question about what had actually been said on the morning of the clearing, Boone did not turn him away. He made a deal immunity from the civil liability in exchange for the truth, and he waited for his turn on the stand with the grim patience of a man who has decided he will not go down alone. On the fourth day of trial, Sawyer Ellison called Earl Boone to the witness stand, and the packed courtroom seemed to draw a single breath and hold it. Marsh at the defense table went the color of old candle wax. Callaway's pen stopped moving on his legal pad. Ellison approached slowly, his voice conversational, almost gentle. Mr. Boone, counsel for the defense, has told this jury that you crossed onto Mrs. Rooker's land because you misread a topographical map, that the whole thing was your honest mistake. Is that true? Boone did not look at Ellison. He turned his heavy face directly toward Dalton. Marsh held the developer's eyes across the well of the courtroom and let the silence stretch until it ached. No, sir, that ain't true. Not one word of it. Ellison stepped to his table, lifted a large laminated blueprint, carried it to the witness stand, laid it in Boone's thick hands. Can you identify this document for the jury? That's the grading map Dalton Marsh handed me himself the morning of the clearing. Boone's voice was flat, unhurried, filling the dead silent room to its stone corners. I looked at it right there in the cab. I saw the line on his map didn't match the survey stakes out in the field. Orange caps, fresh set, plain as daylight, sitting a good 12 acres inside, where his map drew the boundary. I told him so. I told him those stakes marked the widow's orchard, that his map was wrong, that we'd be tearing out trees on land that wasn't ours. The courtroom had stopped breathing entirely. Judge Hargrove sat forward. And what did Mr. Marsh say to you, Mr. Boone, when you told him the map was wrong and the trees belonged to someone else? Boone's jaw worked once. He told me to ignore the stakes, said word for word, bulldoze the trees, let the lawyers handle the old woman. I'll double your day rate for the trouble. Boone reached into the breast pocket of his good shirt, drew out a folded sheet, held it up. He sent it to me in a text message that same morning, so there'd be no mix-up on the rate. I never deleted it. And I got the wire transfer receipt for the bonus he paid me, dated that afternoon after the trees were down. It's all right here. The courtroom erupted. A wave of noise broke across the gallery, gasps, a woman's sharp cry, the scrape of benches as spectators surged. Judge Hargrove's gavel cracked down once, twice, demanding order, but the damage was already done, complete, irreversible. The corporate veil Dalton Marsh had wrapped himself in for months had been torn away in the space of 30 seconds, and beneath it stood exposed exactly what it had always concealed, a man who had been warned plainly and in advance that he was about to destroy another person's land, and who had paid cash to have it done anyway. Marsh buried his face in his hands at the defense table. Beside him, Brett Calloway set down his pen with the slow finality of a physician who has run out of medicine. Ellison entered the text message and the wire receipt into evidence, and he did not belabor his triumph. He simply turned to the jury, let the documents speak, and offered a single closing observation that Opal would carry for the rest of her years. The defense has spent 4 days asking you to believe that a man in a fine suit cannot be a criminal, but a man does not become innocent by keeping his boots clean while other men do his digging. Mr. Marsh did not need to sit in that bulldozer. He only needed to sign the check that put it in motion, then look away while 50 years of a good marriage came down. The defense had nothing left to rebuild. Calloway's closing was a subdued thing, a lawyer's professional obligation performed over the body of a lost cause, an appeal to reasonableness that no longer had any reasonable ground to stand upon. Ellison's closing, by contrast, was quiet and devastating, and he chose to end it not on the number, but on the woman. He asked the jury to remember that the plaintiff had never wanted a courtroom, had never wanted money, had wanted only to be left alone among the trees she had raised like children beside a husband, now 4 years in the ground. He asked them to remember that when Marsh offered $15,000 in the wreckage, Opal Rooker had not taken it because some things a person cannot sell without selling herself along with them. You have heard what these trees were worth in dollars. I ask you now to render a verdict that tells every powerful man watching this valley a simpler truth, that the law does not price patience as weakness, that in the state of Oregon, a quiet woman's roots are not cheaper to destroy than to respect. The jury retired to deliberate in the late morning. Opal had braced herself for days of waiting, had steeled her old heart for a long, agonizing suspense. The jury was back in under 4 hours. The gallery packed itself in again as word raced through the courthouse corridors, and the silence that fell when the foreperson rose to read the verdict was the heaviest Opal had ever stood inside. The foreperson's voice did not waver. On the question of trespass, they found for the plaintiff. On the question of willfulness, they found that Marsh Thornton Holdings had acted knowingly, deliberately, and with full awareness that the land was not theirs. And on the question of damages, they awarded Opal Rooker the full forensic valuation established by Dr. Nathaniel Frame, $4.8 million. Judge Cordelia Hargrove then adjusted her glasses, looked down from her bench at Dalton Marsh with an expression of undisguised contempt, and performed the duty the statute laid upon her. The jury, having determined the value of the property destroyed and having further determined that the destruction was willful within the meaning of Oregon Revised Statute 105.810, it falls to this court to apply the mandatory multiplier the legislature has prescribed for exactly this conduct. Her gavel came down with the weight of 50 years finding their answer. Judgment is entered against the defendants in the amount of $14,400,000 plus the plaintiff's legal fees and costs. Opal Rooker did not cry out. She did not smile. She sat very still at the plaintiff's table, her folded hands unmoving, and she let the number wash over her like the first hard rain after a long drought. And the only thought that surfaced clear in her mind was of Silas, of the porch swing of a promise, kept to a man who had believed in her past the edge of his own life. Across the aisle, a sound came from Dalton Marsh, small and broken, the sound of a man watching his entire world go down the way the crimson trees had gone down, all at once, roots torn from the earth. The fallout arrived swiftly, and it was total. Marsh Thornton Holdings did not possess $14 million in liquid assets, nor anything close to it. The judgment struck the firm's finances like a keel striking rock, and within 30 days, the lenders who had bankrolled the developer's ambitions called in their loans, every one of them, all at once, the way frightened creditors always move together. The construction sites at the reserve at Cedar Hollow went dead, the frozen cranes never lifting again. The half-built faux farmhouse mansions, wrapped in flapping white house wrap, were abandoned mid-frame to weather through the Oregon rain, their empty window openings staring out over the valley like the sockets of skulls. Unable to meet the judgment or its debts, Marsh Thornton was forced into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, its assets seized and liquidated to satisfy the woman it had tried to erase. Dalton Marsh himself was fired by his own trembling board within the week. Publicly disgraced, formally barred from the state's Real Estate Development Association, his name transformed from a threat into a cautionary tale whispered among developers who had learned too late for him which orchards to leave standing. Opal Rooker walked out of the Marion County Courthouse a wealthy woman, wealthier than she had ever imagined being or ever wished to be. She did not move to a beach house in Carmel. She did not travel the world Marsh had once dangled before her on that first arrogant morning. She drove her battered pickup back up the gravel drive to the farmhouse where Silas's reading glasses still kept their vigil on the windowsill, and she sat on the porch swing, alone in the spring dusk, looking out over the wounded southern slope, and she began quietly to plan the only kind of victory that had ever meant anything to her. She used the settlement to buy the bankrupt 300 acres that had encircled her farm, the whole failed footprint of Cedar Hollow purchased at auction for a fraction of what the developer had poured into it. Then she hired crews of her own valley folk who had watched their neighbors sell out one by one workers, glad of the wages and gladder still of the purpose, and she set them to undoing everything Marsh had begun. They tore down the half-frame mansions board by board. They ripped up the freshly poured asphalt of roads that led nowhere. They broke apart the concrete pads, filled the artificial retention ponds, restored the natural grade of the land to something the water would recognize and forgive. In her greenhouse through the long months of the trial, Opal had been keeping a secret and a faith. From the wreckage of the heritage block on her knees in the mud that first terrible week, she had salvaged what fragments of living root and dormant cyanwood she could find, still viable slips of the Rooker's crimson, clinging to fractured rootstock buds, not yet killed by the frost or the treads. She had nursed them under glass with the desperate tenderness of a woman tending the last coals of a fire. She could not let die, her hands performing the grafts exactly as Silas had taught them, joining the salvaged life onto fresh understock. Not all of them took, but enough did. Enough of the crimson survived in those careful pots to prove that Marsh's machines, for all their steel, had failed at the one thing that mattered most. They had not managed to make the thing extinct. Opal partnered with a university whose researchers had once made the drive south to study her husband's work, and together they established the Silas Rooker Agricultural Trust, a permanent foundation dedicated to the preservation of rare and heritage cultivars. Its charter written so that no bulldozer, no developer, no clever loophole would ever again reach the ground it protected. Where the luxury subdivision was to have stood its golf course and its mansions and its paved trails winding past drowned creeks, Opal planted 10,000 new rare apple trees, grafting the recovered Rooker's crimson onto fresh century-old rootstock, sourced from across the country, expanding the heritage orchard into the largest protected botanical sanctuary in the Pacific Northwest. She was 73 by the time the first of the new crimson saplings bloomed, and she walked those young rows in the spring light with a slowness that was age now rather than caution, pausing to steady herself against a stake here, to inspect a graft union there, with hands that still knew their ancient work in the dark. She would not live to see these trees reach the towering maturity of the ones Marsh had murdered. She understood that plainly, without bitterness. A woman who plants heritage trees, plants them for hands she will never shake, for a valley she will not live to see, and Opal had made her peace with that arithmetic half a century before. The first time Silas had watched her graft a scion onto rootstock older than either of their grandparents, and asked her gently who would ever taste the fruit. She gave the empty rose now the answer she had given him, then quiet and certain in the fading light. Not us, love, but someone. That's the whole point of putting anything true into the ground. You never own the shade of the tree you plant. You only get to be the reason it's standing. Yin Teen. The story traveled the valley for years afterward, told at the same feed stores and church suppers, where it had begun and it always ended the same way, with an old woman's roots proving deeper than a rich man's greed. The developers had looked at Opal Rooker and seen a frail widow alone on 40 acres, an obstacle, a puzzle piece, a defeated relic who would take their firewood money and shuffle quietly out of their way. What they had failed to understand, what men like Marsh always fail to understand until the judgment comes down, was that they had mistaken a lifetime of patience for weakness and stillness for surrender. And that some people, when they finally move with the slow and total certainty of the seasons themselves. Opal watched the 10,000 young trees leaf out across ground that was meant to be asphalt, deep-rooted, now protected, untouchable. A living monument to a promise kept and a lesson every powerful man ought to learn before he sends steel across a quiet woman's line. Never mistake the patience of a person who has nothing left to lose for the weakness of someone who has already given up. One tends her roots in silence. The other has simply not yet shown you how deep they run.